So, Alexei, you are our most popular for questions speaker. So, if you would be willing, perhaps, to start with the one I sent you recently, I will send. I will send Graham. I'll send you questions next. I have quite a few of them for you as well. They are pouring in. So, Alexei, but if you would be willing to start on the first one and just read it to us aloud, if you would, that'd be great.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As we agreed with Angela, we will call it not in the middle of the night, but very early morning in Kiev. So I'm really pleased to be with you, and I listened with a great interest to the two previous speakers, and that was probably one of the best presentations about my country that I heard in my life presented by the foreigners, despite Jim Green probably can hardly be called a foreigner because he spent so much time in Ukraine. So the question I got from Angela in advance, I think it's longer than probably my answer would be. The question is, over the past few months, most of us in this room have been pleasantly surprised by Ukraine's heroic and successful resistance, seemingly against the odds. Russia had to abandon its attack on Kyiv. The Russian advance in Donbass has been increasingly slow. Ukraine has had some success with small-scale counterattacks near Kharkiv in the north and Kherson in the south. Could you help us look beyond the day-to-day headlines to better understand what the key factors behind Ukraine's success have been? I'm thinking in terms of Ukraine's own capabilities, Western support, underperformance by Russia, and any other factors you might like to highlight. Looking a few weeks or months ahead into the war, how do you see these factors and their influence shifting? What are the main risks? Well, I can say with the great players that today Ukraine achieved another very symbolic victory, and it is symbolic in a couple of ways, because Russia has to abandon a so-called Zmyiny Island, which is a small island in the Black Sea, but it is strategically important because one who controls the island, especially if it's controlled by the enemy, it provides a strategic position to block the entire Black Sea waters access for Ukraine. So today, Russians were forced to leave the island, and as they said, there were a goodwill, but in fact, it was another symbolic victory achieved by the Ukrainians. Key factors. I would probably mention at least three. First is the Ukrainian state. Ukraine, despite all the problems with its economy, even with corruptions, that's still probably bigger issue in discussions than in the reality. But Ukrainian government and President Zelensky personally have managed successfully well, and quite unexpectedly, I assume even for Zelensky himself, because he's actually doing what a head of state is supposed to do in this crisis situation. Also, our government, who is working like in very different condition, because they especially during first few weeks, they couldn't even work from their offices. But somehow, I personally was surprised when the first day of war, there was electricity, there were mobile connections, there were running water, there were public transportation in Kyiv, and the state was running in this condition. So that's we have to give a big credit to the Ukrainian government that was previously criticized heavily and for many good reasons. The second, or well, if you talk about the Ukrainian state, Ukrainian military in 2022 was and is absolutely different from what it was back in 2014. We had 200,000 active troops, and in addition to about 400,000 veterans willing to fight and capable to fight. Also, one of these key factors that we should say about the state and Ukrainian people and the military capabilities, according to our public opinion polls, in 2021, I mean, at the end of 2021, our public opinion polls show that almost 50% of Ukrainians were at least declared their readiness to defend their country, either with arms or by providing support for the Ukrainian military. And the third factor that I say, the Western support, the international community support, which was absolutely unexpected by the Russians, by the Kremlin, and especially the United States of America. I mean, all the military intelligence provided for Ukrainian economic, financial support, and maintaining sanctions against Russia, maintaining unity, Euro-Atlantic unity. That's something that probably it is not in the rank of the factors like 1, 2, 3. All of them, I think, are equally important. And Jim already described in his presentation the role of NATO training or other partners training provided for the Ukrainian military, and this unique combination of NATO standards, NATO training, and Ukrainian creativity, which was absolutely surprise for the Russians, because the Russians applied and still apply the same Soviet tactics, slightly adjusted to the experience in the wars in Chechnya and in Syria. And of course, Putin's miscalculations of all of these three factors. Looking ahead, it's still, I mean, very challenging and very unclear what's going to happen, because war is full of surprise, sometimes pleasant, but mostly unpleasant surprise. And the current tactics that Russia apply in Ukraine, that's the tactics they practiced in Syria and in Chechnya before. That's intensive shelling and bombing with all their superiority or power in artillery and air power, cruise missiles. There is actually no safe place in Ukraine at all, but on the front line, they fire like 100 tons of shells per day. And one of the reasons that Ukrainian forces are pulling back from the positions in the east, that simply they are not capable to stay there. There is nothing to defend, because everything is being destroyed. And the key risks, despite this factor that Ukrainian forces are outnumbered, outgunned, there are other big factors like Ukrainian economy, because Ukrainian GDP dropped, according to some estimates, at 30 to 50%. So Ukraine, because of this war, will lose probably next year 30 to 50% GDP, and half of the Ukrainians will face very, very hard time regarding sustaining and perspectives of being in great poverty. Other big risks that about 10 billion Ukrainians become IDPs, and about 5 billion Ukrainians left Ukraine as refugees, and it's almost 40% of Ukrainian population. So these people, they have to work somewhere, they have to support their families. So there are plenty of those risks that we can talk, and of course economy, and because Ukraine now spends $5 billion a month for war, and Ukrainian annual budget before the war was $5 billion. So 12 annual defense budget will be spent at least, but there are other issues to be financed, and that's probably one of the major challenges and risks in addition to the Russian aggression. Yeah, but I will stop with quoting one of the Ukrainian high-level officials who in his interview recently said that the biggest challenge for Ukraine in this war that Ukrainian government cannot stop fighting, because if Ukrainian government stops fighting, Ukrainian people will keep fighting, but without this government. Thank you, and I'll be happy if there will be any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexei. Let's see if we can ask Dr. Robertson to go next. I've texted you a couple of questions from the audience, and they're not easy.
Yeah, great. These are not easy questions. I really enjoyed listening to Alexei and his answers, and especially that last line about how the Ukrainian people will continue to fight, whether the government's fighting or not. I think is very deep, profound, and important. I have a couple of questions here. One is what would you say to people who cite Ukrainian corruption as the main issue to stop or cut support to Ukraine? Cutting support to Ukraine on the grounds of corruption would be just perverse. Ukraine has made very significant strides in cutting corruption. It's not perfect, but over the years since the Revolution of Dignity, Ukraine has made enormous progress. Cutting corruption and taming it is extremely hard. Very few countries have done it successfully, and Ukraine has become, in some sense, a laboratory for anti-corruption efforts and exercises, and other countries around the world have been learning from it. And so to use that as an excuse to not support Ukraine in this war would be to give a huge victory to some of the most corrupt people on the earth. Vladimir Putin and his entourage and the entire system that he's built. I think Jim mentioned that the existence of Ukraine is sort of became perceived in the Kremlin as a kind of antimatter, as something that was, just its very existence was destructive to Russia. Well, specifically what the Kremlin, I think, understood by that was the existence of the example of a Slavic country that was fighting corruption, that was promoting democracy, and that was making progress in the world and becoming a better place. That's the part of Ukraine's existence that was so bothersome to the Kremlin, I think, because it was such an obvious example and counterexample to the corrupt, despotic regime that is run from Moscow. So we should support Ukraine more, not less. Another question that I have here is what does Russia gain by reducing cities to rubble? And Alexei touched on this a little bit in the context of Russia's previous experience fighting wars since the collapse of the Soviet Union, specifically in Chechnya and in Syria, where Russian tactics have been precisely to reduce cities to rubble and to destroy everything. And then what that allows them to do is two things. One is it terrorizes the population, and it leads to massive outflows of refugees, which had happened in Syria, and sadly has happened very significantly in Ukraine. But it also gives them the capacity to entirely control the reconstruction process and to rebuild the country through their own contractors, and so basically use reconstruction as a device for corruption, for channeling money to oligarchs and friends of the regime. And it also allows them to create a political system entirely from scratch and to their liking. We saw this especially in Chechnya, where the entire political structure, the whole of the city of Grozny and the whole political structure of the country has been built around something new that was created by the Kremlin and had very little in the way of domestic rootedness or support. And so that's what this strategy is about. And then finally, the question I have is what would it take for Ukraine to win this war? Well, I'm not a military strategist. I wouldn't pretend to be one, and there's better people to answer that question from the military perspective. But from a political perspective, what it'll take for Ukraine to win the war is that the West remain resolute, united, unambiguous, and forceful in its efforts to defend Ukraine and support Ukrainians' ability to defend themselves. I think Jim's point about understanding that Putin doesn't sit with his finger hovering over the nuclear button. Instead, there's actually a whole apparatus between him and it. And there are many grounds to believe that we should not deter ourselves from as Western allies of getting involved and supporting Ukraine more strongly. I think the only force that could stop this war in the short term is NATO. Now, whether that's likely to happen or not, I don't know. But in the short term, that's incredibly important. And then in the longer term, really supporting Ukraine and keeping alive the hope of the Ukrainian people that this struggle is worth it, and that they need to continue to defend their country and that we're there with them. I think these are politically the things that are most important going forward. And thank you for the really interesting questions.
Really interesting perspectives and questions. I have one thought on sort of what Putin is doing in terms of destroying cities. Moscow started to rise in the 14th century under Ivan I. And Ivan I got his position because of Batu Khan, one of the Mongol leaders. The greatest massacre to this day is the destruction of Merv by the Mongols. You've probably never heard of it because it ceased to exist. It was a city the size of Rome. 1 million people were killed. And in effect, that's the legacy that Putin carries on. That legacy of Mongol occupation. Ivan I, by the way, promised to extract tribute better from his own people to get the job. So this isn't just a short-term legacy. This is a whole different mindset about the relationship between people and power. The two questions that I have, one is you start with one on peace negotiations, and how do we know, the question was, how do we know if peace negotiations are successful, and will the Russians keep their word? Because if we look at the Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons, Russia wasn't supposed to attack Ukraine or even pressure it with economic terms, and it was violated almost immediately. I would say here you have to understand that from a Russian perspective, a negotiation is a statement of the facts that exist at that moment. It's the same way with contracts, by the way. Just because you have a contract today and there's a price written in it today for 5 years doesn't mean in 3 years that someone doesn't come to you and they say, that price is different now. Say, we have a contract. What's that to me? So I think we have to be very clear that whatever happens is supported by facts on the ground. In the end, the greatest guarantor of whatever peace comes will be Ukraine's NATO membership. And I think that Ukraine's NATO membership will be the greatest guarantor of whatever peace negotiation happens, and I think that will come faster than people think. I think the European Union membership will take a long time because there are lots of details, and it's all about trade and economics. But I think NATO membership, Ukraine has shown itself to be fully capable of it. And if the elite steps up and doesn't play the kind of gray zone games, that will happen quite quickly, and that will be the strongest guarantor. There was a question on the constraints on Putin's use of nuclear weapons. So there are several steps. If a head of state gives an order to use nuclear weapons, there are steps that have to happen. They don't just have a button on their desk. They give an order, the order is relayed, it goes out to units, there are procedures that happen. It's pretty obvious at this point to people around Putin that he's taking the country to a dead end. A nuclear attack would be a suicide mission for the country. They would be killing themselves, their families. And in fact, there's strong speculation, backed up, I think reasoned speculation, that the U.S. has made very clear that the use of any nuclear weapon in the war will result in the use from our side of a nuclear weapon. And that nuclear weapon will be on the command point where Vladimir Putin is. So whoever he gives the order to had better start running. And given the situation, Putin knows that there's as much chance that instead of passing the order through, he'll be arrested or even shot by someone who doesn't want his family to die. I think that's one of the factors that, as a KGB guy, he understands where the limits of how he can push are. And the final question here, it's actually a very good one. It comes back to, I think, the reason we're here today. As an old soldier with experience building international relationships, I see great opportunity for our community to support Ukraine. We have a great community here. We're doing important work with Afghan new arrivals. What support can we provide to build the city-to-city networks vital to Ukrainian survival and future? And I would say here, I think the first thing is to start a dialogue. Don't wait for the peace treaty. Start it now. Find out what they need. Find out what the issues are. Some of those are going to be material. And we're at a risk now where so much is happening at a high level. Governments are coming in. UN is coming in. We think, the little bits of money that we were giving at the beginning made a difference, but now they don't because all these big mechanisms are happening. That's not true. When you partner at a local level, tremendous things can happen with very modest resources. Sometimes those resources are up here. Someone dealing with a problem in a city, how do we deal with this problem? Find someone here who deals with a similar problem. We might not have a solution for them, but just helping them talk it through, think it through. Talk to someone who shares their professional background. Like any of those kinds of contacts that bring people out of that crisis, that give them support, that provide them some kinds of resources can be important. I have people right now asking me for communications gear, for example. And there's a potential to support that, like right here in Asheville. So I would say that's kind of the start, and be practical, and be person to person, concrete people to concrete people over time.
Great questions. Thank you so much for actively participating in the Q&A. Now, I would like to thank both of our Zoom virtually present presenters today. And I don't see them on my screen, but there you go, thank you so much. Dr. Robertson, Alexei, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts here. And yes, and there are many ways and applause to you. So we hope. Yes, so Dr. Robertson, we wish you an enjoyable, relaxing vacation with your family as you embark on it tomorrow. We hope it's restful. Yes, please come back, and I'd like to be in touch with you, see what else we can invite you to. And Alexei, Mr. Melnik, we wish you to stay safe, and for your family to be safe, and for all your friends and colleagues. We will be thinking of you and pondering over the excellent points that you've shared. Thank you. Thank you very much.